Hello again. I'm going to pour myself some more Japanese green and barley tea. Good to drink at night. It doesn't get you as wired as coffee. One reason I'm making these videos tonight, even though I made videos in the morning, was tomorrow it's projected to be lots of rain and storms, possibly thunder. So even if I'm locked in all day and have plenty of time to make videos, the audio might be terrible. So this is why I'm here. And this relates to the level of technology I have. I don't have a level of technology that can filter out thunder and edit these things. And frankly, I may have some capacity on this laptop, but I'm not very computer literate, right? I was literally born in 1969. I grew up, came of age in the 80s and lived through the 70s, and here we are. 2024, I'm going to be 55 May 1st, literally just a few days from now. And I feel like I'm doing pretty good with technology, but I am behind the times in a lot of things. So, speaking of technology, we were talking about the fact that these UAP seem to violate known physical laws, but it's not so much physical laws, but they appear to surpass our level of material science and technological capabilities. Arthur C. Clarke, a famous sci fi writer, said that any sufficiently advanced technology will be indistinguishable from magic. And to that, I would add, especially if you don't know what it is. So I talked a little bit about military technology and material science. So for the longest time, a stick with tendon and string curved into a bow and strung, and then arrows made of wood, feather, glue, and tipped with either stone or metal. That was it. That was advanced. And it's not to be laughed at. An English war bow that has a pull of about 100 pounds to 150 pounds, let's say, could propel a steel tip or iron tip bow a long distance, easily punch through chainmail. An unarmored person could be speared almost completely through and through. If it hit something like your neck at the right angle, it would pass through your body. It's nothing to be laughed at. Later, the composite bow was developed, where you took a piece of wood and then you took horn and then tendon and you lashed it together, glued it together, and you created this reflex deflex design. So a longbow bends like this, but a reflex deflex curves like this, and the nocks, they're called Sias, curve towards the enemy. And unstrung, the bow looks like a C, and you have to really labor to get it strung. And it's possible to get a bow that's very short, shorter than an English longbow, with the same level of pull weight, but however, its shape and material capability allow the arrow to travel much faster, right? And if you had, let's say, an arrow of comparable weight, but maybe not length, but some of these things can easily be overdrawn without damage to the same length as an English bow. Even with the same amount of pull weight, it's traveling faster. Therefore has more kinetic energy, and that gets transferred to your target, and could potentially have greater range. So, fearsome weapon, an update of the technology. But then later, for example, the Turks, when they were invading Europe, different parts of Europe, encountered, and the Mongols encountered this in their campaign in India. Humidity and dampness can degrade that bow. It can even start to disintegrate or lose its efficiency. Whereas the longbow, if it's wet for a long time, they become temporarily non functional or dysfunctional. But if it's dried properly, it can be used again. So then, what did the Ottomans do? And the Indians? At one point, they invented a steel bow. So, material science, right? Nowadays, our weapons are incredible. We have nuclear weapons, guided weapons, we have drones, we have anti drone drones, we have remotely guided ships, and so on and so forth. GPS, right? Material science and technology. So these things appear to, at the very least, have near miraculous material science and technological capabilities. And again, it is a techno signature. This doesn't appear to be supernatural. So, again, let's talk about some of the ways in which they fly. Let's talk about the fact that the way we make things fly is we use kinetic energy. We use jets and rockets and things like that. And we could, you know, potentially use a cannon to launch something high up and it will come crashing down like artillery. Theoretically, if you had a big enough cannon and it was strong enough to resist the amount of explosive use, you could launch something into space. And there's talk of a linear accelerator which uses a series of magnets to launch something potentially into orbit, right? But our gravity does restrict that. We don't see any of that in these UAP reports. You have things that appear to be huge and substantial, literally flying around and hovering, landing and leaving again, leaving no exhaust trail, no heat signature, or anything like that. Although there are accounts and tales of radiation present, and some of this radiation is dangerous, has harmed people, and potentially resulted in medical conditions that turned into a fatality later. And there are reports of people that got treated for these things, for this radiation induced sickness, and successfully. Joe McMoneagle stands up. He's one of the premier figures in remote viewing, and that is a topic for another potential book, but that's on right on the borderline of scientific and supernatural. All right, it's an interesting intersection. And also things that travel fast, even if they had no kinetic propulsion system, should, due to friction with the air, be generating lots of heat and potentially ablating, which means, you know, you hear about things falling down like a meteor from the sky, right? And as they go through our atmosphere, the friction builds up heat, but it also, the combination of heat and friction strips off molecules, which is why they kind of have a tail, right? And that doesn't appear to be happening, and there is no explanation. We can only say there must be some technological thing that can be done, not just to move these things the way they do, but to insulate them from friction and mitigate the heat that comes up. And you also hear these things moving, and I've read no reports of sonic booms, which generally happens when you cross the speed of sound. And there may be some. And I've even seen the stealth fighter fly overhead here in Mizzou for one of our football games, and you can not just hear the sound of the engines, but there's like a rumble you can feel. Okay, so none of that appears to be happening. This leads me to think that these craft, whatever they are, many of them may not contain any organic life or matter. Certainly not as we know it. They may be powered by AI or remotely piloted. Either that, you hear about bigger craft, things coming down to pick things up and pick people and interact with them. And they have inhabitants, but it may be that the larger things have inhabitants, but they also, many of them appear to have these amazing flight characteristics. They may have a way of mitigating momentum, the effects of momentum and gravity. I mean, we're getting into the esoteric here, but one possibility is that they have the ability to manipulate gravity and have a reverse gravity, which I know of no serious theoretical basis for that. I would love to read about it, love to talk about it from a credible source, especially a peer reviewed article in a scientific journal. I don't claim to be have an encyclopedic knowledge of that. Another possibility is manipulation of magnetism, which I mean, we have almost everything has a magnetic field. Our planet does, our sun does, our galaxy. There's magnetic fields throughout the cosmos, and if there's a way to tap into all of that to maneuver, then yeah, maybe that would explain a lot of things. I don't know how. I know to some extent how magnetic fields can shield you from radiation and things like that. And I've watched Star Trek and Star Wars. There's talk of a force field, a tractor beam, things like that, but we don't really have a basis for that. But I mean, a lot of things in science fiction have a tendency to come true. Personal computing, AI, genetic manipulation, nuclear weapons, all of that was thought of in science fiction. Sometimes 100 years or more before it happened. So that's something to think about, right? Um, all of this gets back to why this is an important issue and the implications of these things if we take them to be facts. You could get lazy and say it's all nonsense. All those Navy pilots, all those instrumentation have failed over and over again over decades, from the last century to this one. I think that's being very lazy. All right, but something has happened. And we talked about navigational hazards. Let's get into that. There are navigational rules on this planet that are almost universally applied. I mean, aircraft have different lights, and they tend to illuminate some while flying in things like red lights uh, when landing, and military craft use red lights during operations because they don't mess with your night vision as much, right? And but generally, there are nationally and internationally accepted rules of behavior when it comes to aircraft. There are places where you are not allowed to fly. You're expected to have a transponder. You're expected to give out regular radio messages. Your lights indicate the presence of the aircraft. And, you gain permission before landing somewhere and so on and so forth. None of these things appear to have a lot of regard for those rules. Um, Much in the same way, an ant hill could have rules, but birds don't obey them, because these ants have no power and authority over them. They barely notice the ants, and the ants are kind of too small to feed off of most of the time, right? So, yeah, it's something to think about. All right. A techno signature that doesn't appear to follow our rules or acknowledge them, respect our borders, and seems to be completely not just beyond our capability, but beyond any attempt we have to control them. And yet they do respond sometimes when our craft approach them or communicate certain things around them, but they don't appear. Again, this is just the publicly disclosed information. If there has been communication, we'd all love to hear it, and we're going to have to work hard to get it disclosed because it's our first date, right? Now, let's talk about some of the potential threats. This is how I conclude the chapter. And again, this is just to drive home the fact that even if there is no ill intent, there are hazards that we should mitigate, and we will not be able to do anything about it if we don't investigate. All right? So, the first one is dropping things, okay? If you had the flight capabilities of these things and the ability to land and go through mediums. You could destroy an aircraft carrier just by dropping a rock on it from a big enough height and aiming it right. There's that much kinetic energy, right? A 35-pound kettlebell. Picture this. You have a 35-pound kettlebell or a 50-pound kettlebell, and you drop it from orbit, right? And you time it just right so it hits an aircraft carrier. But as it's coming down, it could potentially lose mass. So you take, let's say, the ceramic stuff that covers the tiles on the space shuttle, and you cover the kettlebell with it so that it maintains its velocity and its mass. It does build up heat through friction. It reaches maximal drop velocity and it crashes into the aircraft carrier. That's a lot of kinetic energy, right? So, I mean, you could potentially sink or heavily damage that aircraft carrier, especially if you're capable of aiming it precisely. And what if you just took rocks? I mean, our solar system is filled with asteroids and meteors, and many of them are made of nickel iron. I mean, conceivably, if you had a piece of nickel iron, say, weighing about 3 tons, and you chopped it up into 50-pound increments and just launched it from orbit, man, if you can aim those things accurately, that is very dangerous. My friend Carl talked about a weapon which is basically an orbital platform that has rebar and just drops rebar from space. Maybe you could put ceramic on it and then put something like fins on the back, kind of like the fletching on an arrow, and just a tiny bit of extra weight on the front, and now it's going to fall straight. All right. So anything capable of the flight that it can deliver payloads. And it doesn't even have to be intentional. What if it's flying up there and a piece of it falls off, and that piece happens to be built of some advanced metal that's strong enough to take all the stresses? That's a hazard, right? And they appear to be all over the globe, and they certainly appear to cluster around our aircraft carriers and our nuclear facilities. And by the way, violating the restricted airspace of aircraft carriers, military bases, and nuclear facilities would be considered a hostile act. Now, again, many of these things do not appear to exhibit any overt hostility, but inadvertent hostility, well, inadvertently putting someone in danger through ignorance or simply not thinking the rule is important is still a serious matter. And there's also the possibility of contamination. Simply put, just transporting things across borders without going through inspection and examination can cause an infection. Think about SARS, think about COVID, think about the bubonic plague in older times and smallpox, right? So, again, accidentally, if there was a life form or a virus or something like that from another planet, another biosphere, that could get here and easily infect us or eat us or something like that, and it got loose in our atmosphere, well, that would certainly pose a threat, especially if we specifically were able to communicate with them and say, do not bring that here, and they brought it here anyway because they're like, you can't, this isn't really important, they're just a bunch of ants, right? So even if it is not a hostile act, it could be potentially harmful act, and we need to think about this. And the other thing is, let's take a look at all of these things as a reflection of our taxes, our military structure, our intelligence agencies. I mean, folks, we pay a lot of money to the military. We pay them a lot of money to the 3 and 4 letter agencies, the intelligence community, and one of the things we expect them to do with their money is we expect at the very least a form of security, military security. At the very least, the military needs to be able to secure itself. Okay? Even if there is no invading force like the Marine Corps, you can't just leave rifles and tanks and vehicles lying around any old place unguarded. Someone else could take them and do harm with them. But it appears that our most critical assets, our most critical military assets, are incapable of doing their job. Look how concerned people are about a secure border and illegal aliens and things like that. And there are so many issues with that, but I mean, none of what's happening at the border seems to travel right to an aircraft carrier task force, a nuclear asset, right? Compared to that, it's almost a non-issue. Whereas if you have foreign alien technology running circles around our most critical military and nuclear assets, and there's nothing we can do about that, talk about an insecure border, talk about illegal aliens, right? And if we have the means to communicate with these things, and we are not, or we're failing at that, we really need to put pressure on our government, our elected officials. We need to talk to people in the military and so on and so forth, and people in the scientific community, and say, look, I don't know what these things are, but there's all this evidence that they're doing X, Y, and Z in this manner around our most critical stuff that we pay. We pay our military so we can sleep at night knowing we're safe, knowing that someone's just not going to turn our nuclear weapons on or off or mess with our nuclear reactors, that no one's going to just potentially sink aircraft carriers and down airplanes with impunity. And maybe now it's becoming an issue where members of the general public are actually thinking, well, what do we pay you for? All right? Think about it. If you live in an apartment complex, and it's one of the high-end apartment complexes, they got a security system, they have an alarm system, they have security guards, and you find out the alarms are useless, the security guards will not respond to an external threat, or there's an external threat, there's a group of thieves that can break in and just get past the guards, past your cameras. Wouldn't you talk to the landlord? You'd be like, I'm paying you this money. I know I pay rent and I pay utilities, and there's a fee for the security system built into it. And that part isn't doing any good. What do you plan on doing about it? All right? Now, we're going to move on to Chapter 2 in the next video. This concludes Chapter 1. And I may add an additional addendum or digression to Chapter 1. Haven't fully thought about that yet. But either way, we are going to get through more chapters. And there's about, I think, a little more than 10 chapters in this thing. So I'm having fun. It's getting late. My throat's getting dry. It's a persistent problem with me right now. But I look forward to seeing you in the next video. I look forward to talking about Chapter 2. And you all have a good night.